welcome back to Learn It from a Layman. I'm Carl Christensen. I'm here with Cameron Christensen, Tim Cox, also, I guess, and back for after a bit of an absence, Jonny Nielsen. Jonny, you think that becoming like a full-on doctor gives you an excuse to skip our podcasts?
Yes. Oh wait,
okay, fine.
That's not the response we had worked out before. No, I'm sorry.
That's correct.
Sorry.
What am I paying you for?
Wait, what? I get paid?
No, nobody.
Okay.
That's
Carl, token payments. $2.
You get
One
the same
time.
percentage
I'll
of
pay you in tokens.
that I get from all the ads that we have.
Yeah, exactly.
You can pay me in gum, okay?
I will pay you in Chuck E. Cheese tokens.
Those are worth real money, so.
Well, not right now because they're all closed. So.
Dang it, COVID! You just ruined all my payments.
That's right.
I'll send you
Anyway.
some more.
Okay, let's get started with the podcast today. So this one is a very important podcast, I feel, because this is one I'm going to ask our viewers to do what I think most podcast hosts always ask their viewers to do or listeners to do. But this one I actually want you to do. Generally, I don't particularly care because I appreciate our audience, but listen if you want to and don't if you don't. But this one I actually think is important, and I really think it should be shared because it's going to be really useful and I think meaningful. So today's podcast is about seizures. And there's this podcast topic was precipitated by an event in my family earlier this week. So I'm going to give you that story, and then we got Jonny on here, who's a doctor, and can tell us a little bit more about seizures than I can, just based on my one individual experience with the seizure, which, while meaningful, is not obviously the information that Jonny would otherwise be able to give us. So, and then Cameron and Tim can chime in with any seizure information that they have, which I don't know of any, but maybe they will surprise me and know things that I don't know, which would be not an infrequent occurrence anyway. Most people know things that I don't know. Okay, let's get started. All right, so before we start talking some of the science behind seizures, and Jonny helps us out with that, I'm going to give you this story. So this one is, I can talk about it normally now, and I can even almost joke about it. This is only 4 days ago. On Sunday, I told you I'm a father.
Callous.
Yeah. Well, I said it was. Let's get through the story. Okay. So on Sunday afternoon, I'm sitting around at home. I've got 5 children, my wife, and so we're all at home together on Sunday afternoon. And my daughter, my 4-year-old daughter, has been complaining about a stomach ache, and so we don't really think much about it. She's 4. She often complains about things that aren't particularly real, and she frequently threatens to vomit, and really irrespective of like how she's feeling or what's going on, she just thinks that that's kind of fun. So she's talking about having to throw up, and we're like, well, fine, whatever. And so that's happened most mornings, and she seems more legitimately talking about it. And so we think, okay, well, maybe she's got an upset stomach. We'll see what happens. So this is some like 1:20 in the I don't know, sometime in the early afternoon. My daughter says that she needs to go to the bathroom, and so we say, okay, go ahead. So at 4, she's almost 5. She'll come up on 5 soon, and so we don't go with her to the bathroom, obviously. And we think maybe there's some diarrhea involved or something along those lines. And so she goes, and we don't hear from her. Honestly, I wasn't tracking time at all. I wasn't even thinking about it. My wife, a little better than I was for sure. So my daughter's in the bathroom for I don't know how long. My wife then yells, "Hey, do you need help? Is there something wrong?" And there's no response, which is uncommon for my daughter, who is generally pretty talkative, she's a feisty one. And so, but even then, we didn't think anything of it. My wife doesn't think that. She just assumes that means, no, I'm not done. So a couple more minutes go by, and then my wife goes to check on her. And as she walks into the bathroom, luckily the door was not locked. She sees my daughter kind of slumped over on the toilet, kind of completely unresponsive, and kind of beginning to vomit, and not doing so well. So essentially, she's choking on her vomit, and she is just out of it, like she's not there. So when my wife first walks in, she sees some vomit, and she yells for me, and I start getting up slowly off the couch, and then all of a sudden there's followed by a far more urgent yell of, "I don't think she's breathing," and that obviously changed the whole tenor of things. So I get up and I run as fast as I can to the bathroom, and I see my daughter sitting in there, and she has got vomit down the front of her. She is completely glassy-eyed, so she's not unconscious, but she's like slumped over and awake, but nobody's home. And she's choking on vomit on her throat, and she's not really breathing particularly. Like if she's breathing at all, which I can't tell. I'm not. It's incredibly scary. So she's just flopped sideways on the toilet, and so I pick her up, and there's nothing there. There's no response. There's no, and so I start giving her the Heimlich. At first, I just patting her on the back really hard, thinking that she's choked on something and she can't breathe. And so then that's not helping much. She's still kind of gurgling. And so then I start giving her the Heimlich a bit, not super aggressive. She's 4, but just trying to get something out of her. And she vomits a little bit more. And at that point, it didn't seem like she was choking on anything more, but she was still completely gone, right? Glassy-eyed, and unable to really focus on anything. Her body is alternatively like tense, but somehow also limp in a really weird and very disturbing way. And so I pick her up. I'm trying to get her to say anything, right? I'm saying, talking to her. I'm saying, talk to me. And nothing, no response. And so I pick her up, and I say, I got to get it. Take her outside. Fresh air, something. And so I grab her and I take her outside. And at this point, she's I'm just trying to get her to say anything. And finally, at one point, I'm saying, say your name, say your name. And then I get a response from her, but it's one that's honestly more disturbing, if that's possible. And it was just this kind of very incoherent, okay, which to me almost. So what was running through my mind this whole time is we didn't know how long she'd been sitting there in the bathroom, choking on her own vomit, and so my brain automatically goes to she didn't have oxygen for a large period of time. She's sustained serious brain damage. So probably things that don't necessarily fit at all the situation I was dealing with, but in my mind at the time were the only explanation. So I'm trying to get her to say anything. She can't say anything. I mean, okay was the only thing I could get from her, and it wasn't like an okay you normally get from her, right? It was like a okay. And so I'm fully disturbed. By the way, my wife called 911. Right as soon as we both were in there and recognizing this was far beyond anything we had ever encountered before. So my wife was on the phone with 911 this whole time. And so anyway, the ambulance comes. We pass her off to the EMTs, and they seem pretty chill about it, honestly. I'm sure that's generally the way they're supposed to address this, is not be overly panicked. It doesn't really help as a parent when I don't want them panicked either, but their lack of panic does not like somehow like diminish my panic. And so up to that point, I had done a pretty darn good job as far as I'm concerned about like keeping pretty cool. I'm sure I was talking pretty fast, probably doing some things that didn't make a lot of sense, but I wasn't doing anything like completely out there. I wasn't trying to hurt my daughter or like slap her awake or like, I don't know. Anyway, I'd been pretty cool about it. Had her off to the EMTs. The EMTs say something about a seizure, but it wasn't clear to me if they were talking about like she was having a seizure at that moment, and therefore like as a result of whatever had happened before, she's now having a seizure. Anyway, like I said, lack of information. I didn't know what was going on. So they put her in the ambulance. They say, one parent can come with us, the other one can follow behind. So my wife gets in the ambulance. They start taking her. I walk inside, and that's when I, like, as a parent, I couldn't control anything at that point, and I was an emotional wreck. I am, as most male in our society are, generally not particularly emotional, but at that moment I was completely out emotionally, and so because out of my control, when I was in my control is a strong word for what happened at any point during that time, but when I felt like I had my daughter with me, I was trying to address the situation and do things that I thought made sense. I could control it, but as soon as I passed her off and still didn't know what was going on, it was like the worst feeling of my life. So my other children are like confused, sad. They've never seen their dad act like this. So I just kind of sit there glazed, like just out of it for like 10 or 15 minutes, trying to figure out who I need to call, what I'm supposed to do. I think I was supposed to follow my wife on in the car, but I didn't do anything for like 10 minutes other than kind of cry and just sit there. And because in my mind, once again, what had happened was my daughter had choked on her vomit, not had enough oxygen, and sustained brain damage. Because we didn't know how long she'd been in there, and I didn't have any other explanation for this situation. Anyway, so then my wife texts me while she's in the ambulance on the way to the hospital at the word seizure. And so I call her right away, and she said she's having a seizure right now. And so she was having a seizure in the ambulance. And so that didn't really give me more information and just made things, not making things worse. It was already pretty bad. Anyway, so I finally get in the car, drive to the hospital, and we're in the coronavirus season, right? So they won't let me in because only one person can visit any patient at any time. And so my wife is with our daughter, and I'm not allowed in. As I relive this in my mind afterwards, I wish I'd been slightly more confrontational. I mean, my 4-year-old daughter is, in my mind, like dying, or if not dying, brain damaged, and I need anyway. And so the security guard, so I'm on the phone with my wife, who's talking to the nurse, and the nurse is saying, "Let him in. Tell the security guard to let him in. He can come in." And the security guard saying, "No, I will not." And it was incredibly frustrating. I'm generally a good-natured person, and so I unfortunately, I was at the time too. I kind of once again that I've been slightly more confrontational because, look, I generally understand the coronavirus restrictions and you want to make things safe, but this I thought was a pretty darn extraordinary circumstance, and I wanted to be in by my daughter. And so anyway, finally, the nurse walks all the way out to where I am and tells the security guard, "Let him in," and he lets me in. And so I get back in there, and they've done a CT scan already. They have ruled out, any brain tumor, which we'll talk about in a second. And they've ruled out a couple other things as well. And generally, I get that they seem pretty. I mean, they're still. She's she's in the emergency room. I believe she was the only person there at that time, actually. And they're still around. They're taking care of her. They're helping out. But I feel like everyone seems more at peace with this, and I don't understand why. No one has explained anything to me yet. And my daughter, they gave her some anti-seizure drugs on the way there that essentially knocked her out. And so she's unconscious. And so I don't know what's going on. My daughter is unconscious on the table. Last time I saw her, she was essentially not any better than that. And so finally, the nurses are helpful, but they're not really explaining too much. So finally, the doctor comes in, and she finally So this is like an hour and a half later. I get the doctor said this is incredibly unlikely that there's any brain damage involved here. She at the time does not give me. She mentioned seizure. I don't remember getting a full explanation of like what probably happened from her. She was helpful in that she reassured me that it was not brain damage, and that was the first relief I had had in like 90 minutes, which for me felt like an eternity. But they transferred her. That was a pretty small hospital, and they transferred her. I live close to San Diego. They transferred her to Rady's Children's Hospital, which is one of the top children's hospitals in the United States, which I felt fine about. Another long ambulance drive, though, unfortunately. So anyway, we finally get down to Rady's, and finally the doctor walks in and tells me, Cameron's making the money symbol. Yes, very likely. This is an expensive educational experience for me. But anyway, I'm fine to pay this bill in as much as my daughter is okay now. Unfortunately, I probably didn't have to pay all of this bill for her to be okay, but it's once again an expensive educational opportunity for me. Anyway, so we're down in Rady's. They're transferred her in. They let us in because they have her in the ICU there as well, which I wasn't entirely clear why, but whatever. It did mean that both parents could be in. The rule there was if you're in the ICU, the children's ICU, both parents can come in. And so I was allowed in. And so finally the doctor there comes in, and that's when he was a good doctor. He comes in and just explains top to bottom. First he asked for the information, which I believe you probably already read somewhere, but just recounted, and then he's like, look, this is probably what happened, and then he brings up finally the term that for me was a completely new term, and that was febrile seizure. Jonny, is that the right way to pronounce it? Febrile?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so febrile seizure, and he explains to me what that means. He says essentially it's a seizure provoked by some type of viral infection, most likely, that also manifests usually in a fever. And the fever is usually a high-grade fever. Now, they had taken her temperature a couple times at the hospital, and at one point, right after they brought her in, she had a fever. It wasn't a high-grade. It was like 100.8 Fahrenheit, 38.1, 38.2. And before that, I believe at home she hadn't had a fever, because when she was complaining about a stomachache that morning, I didn't take out a thermometer, but I had felt her head, her back. She seemed fine to me. But once again, they'd taken her temperature at the hospital and gotten a reading that said that she did have a fever, and the doctor said, okay, so that's all we really need in order to say this is a febrile seizure. Essentially, it's a provoked seizure. It's children, and maybe Jonny can give us more information. Children, this happens in children, and it's not really common, but it's also not extremely uncommon, and generally it is fine. And so he said, we're going to, given all that information and the fever and your daughter's age, we're going to assume that that's what it is without any other information. The CT scan was clean. So anyway, so to wrap up the story, essentially we stayed overnight in the hospital so they could observe her, and she was a little drunk that night. With the drugs they'd given her. So I'd never seen a 4-year-old drunk before, but essentially she was showing my wife a magic trick that involved her spitting ice out of her mouth and then sucking it back in, which to her was incredibly funny. Even for a 4-year-old, that's a low bar. Yeah, she was a little bit loopy. Anyway, so by the next day she was fine. They did eventually actually bring. The doctors seemed to be very of the opinion that this was probably not a huge deal. And after I got explained to me, I understood kind of why. But they, as you'd want to be, and generally they wanted to be really careful. And anyway, they brought in a neurologist to look at her CT scan, even though it looked clean to them, and then to do kind of an interview with her and check on her. And he said it probably is not necessary. He said he's going to order as a sleep-deprived EEG. Sleep depriving a 4-year-old is going to be a nightmare. That's supposed to be something that we do in like 2 weeks, because you can't do it right after the seizure. Otherwise, I guess you can get some type of false readings. But we're supposed to sleep deprive my daughter and then take her in for an EEG, because that will, I guess, those people that have seizures are prone to seizures. If you get them in a stressful environment, including sleep deprivation, that will provoke some type of brain activity that they can then get in the EEG that'll tell them that she has an issue. Anyway, he said he ordered it. It seemed like it was something that every other doctor, though, seemed to say that wasn't entirely necessary. Even he himself said, this isn't really something I have to do, but just to be certain, let's rule anything else out. Anyway, so we'll see what happens. But that
just means that you still were acting like you were worried, so he wanted to reassure you.
Well, I think he had like a resident doctor, which you know something about, John. You're a resident doctor, with him, and he was like trying to like walk through what the options were. Essentially, it was almost like he was trying to show off. I don't know if that's a thing, but I don't know. Anyway, like I'm not going to complain.
The resident was trying to show off to
not the resident. This was the actual like doctor, like the
okay.
Like the resident doc. The doctor was like talking to us sometimes, and at times it seemed like he was directing his comments to the resident doctor, and saying like, this is what I recommend and this is what I think. What do you think, Doctor So and So? And obviously the resident doctor isn't going to refute this guy who's clearly like an elderly doctor, somewhere in his late 50s, I'm guessing. But it generally seemed to me, even with all that I heard, it wasn't entirely necessary. But I'm not going to complain. My daughter is fine. If they needed an EEG, then whatever. I don't care.
Yeah, just to touch base on that, if you ever find yourself in a teaching hospital, that's actually a very normal thing to happen, because in a teaching hospital, the resident is learning from the boss doctor, which is called the attending. Okay. So the attending will go into the room with you, and a lot of times the attending is teaching at the bedside, because it helps the resident to be able to remember the things that they need to do by attaching it to a situation. So okay. It's pretty common to do that. Sometimes it seems like a lot of overkill for the family, but it actually is very helpful for the resident to be able to learn this stuff. So anyway, I'm sure that's what was happening.
I'm sure you're right, and that makes sense, and I appreciate the idea that doctors are very good about getting trained very well. It makes it significantly easier to trust the doctors, and so I appreciate that. And I don't have any issues with any of these things. I'd rather that they are safe careful with my daughter than not. And if it means being over careful, then whatever. Especially after the kind of nightmare experience I lived, that brief time period on that Sunday afternoon, dude, whatever it takes. I mean, essentially, I'm happy to pay whatever I need to pay in order to make sure that my daughter's okay, and she is now, right? She's just fine, and she's acting entirely normal. It honestly made me slightly different, I think, at least in the last few days, far more patient and generally grateful for her and for my other kids. So in some ways it's been a good thing. But anyway, the point of this podcast, and this being a Learn It from a Layman podcast, so once again we're talking educational, is to start talking a little bit more about seizures and febrile seizures and get that information out there. So I'll ask Jonny now to tell us a little bit more.
Deprive a 5-year-old?
No, please don't do that unless it's under doctor's orders. It's a horrible idea.
I was like, cranky, sleep-deprived 5-year-old does not sound like a fun thing.
No, it was. So,
you'll enjoy that in a week and a half.
Yeah, I mean, I've experienced her sleep-deprived before. It's not a good time.
I find that 5-year-olds are more often working on sleep depriving us.
She does come to the side of the bed at unnatural hours and ask us to come read her a book or tell us it's time to wake up, and it's like, no, actually it turns out we don't wake up at 4. Get in bed.
I'm up at 4. Just have her call me.
Yeah, exactly.
I wake up at 4 sometimes.
Well, okay. Jonny and Cameron have special circumstances. My guess, Jonny, is that Tim and I are the ones that here are the ones that don't have to wake up at unusual hours for work. So Anyway, okay, Johnny, you're going to tell us a little bit about, if you could just give us a little more information, whatever you know, the febrile seizures. You're a pediatric doctor now, so this is kind of your wheelhouse, right?
Yeah, so in pediatrics, one thing that's actually very common are febrile seizures, more common than you'd think. And if you did like a Facebook poll or went out there on some social media platform and asked, do you know somebody who has had a febrile seizure, or have you had a febrile seizure? You'd probably hear more people than not
Yeah.
that would have happened to them.
Yeah, let me cut you.
It's happened to you, one of your kids, and it also happened to one of my other friends' kids. And it can happen over and over again too. Whenever the kid gets fevers, if they've had a febrile seizure before, they can have another one. It's like a 40% chance or something like that. So it's a pretty high chance that they'll have one again. They usually stop around 5, so you're getting to the late stage of that. So probably not something you need to worry about too much. But just keeping a fever under control would be better. But it is something that's not really talked about, because in the moment it's really scary. But then after you talk to the doctor, they just reassure you that it's very normal and that it's not harmful. And then I think you just get assured that, like, okay, well, this is fine. And then you just don't tell people about it.
Right.
Plus, like, it makes you feel crazy when you're like, well, my daughter was okay, but I lost my mind.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. And so from the doctor's point of view, I completely understand. And like you said, like it happens to more people than you'd imagine. The number I saw, and the number I believe that they told us in the hospital, was like 4% of kids will before they're 5 between 5 and 6 is usually when it stops. 4% of kids will experience a however you're saying, febrile. I don't know how you're saying. You make it sound better.
Febrile. Yeah.
Febrile. Okay. Right. Febrile. A febrile seizure before they are before they're 5 or 6. So if you think about that, that's like one in every like essentially, if your kids goes to kindergarten, one of your kids in your kindergarten's class will probably have experienced a febrile seizure.
Yeah, in a class of 25 people, one will probably have had a seizure from a fever sometime in their life, it's more common than you'd think it would be. But yeah, it's very scary. It's very scary for parents. It's very real. It is a real seizure. They have actual seizure activity. So if they have an EEG on, which basically measures the brain activity, you can tell when there's seizure activity it's like all the wires that are attached to your head. You've probably seen it on sci-fi movies and stuff like that. But it has different waves, and it can tell you what type of seizure they're having, or if they're having a seizure. And febrile seizures are a real seizure. There are like what some people call psychogenic seizures, or non-epileptic seizures, where it's like a psychiatric type issue where people will have seizure-like activity, but it's actually not epileptic. Like their brain signal isn't showing a seizure, but they're having seizure signs, which is something totally unrelated to febrile seizures. But anyway, I would say to all the parents out there, if your child has a fever and has a seizure, even though that is a pretty common thing and it's not super dangerous, they still need to go to the doctor and get checked. The reason being is that you need to rule out the really dangerous things. So things that can cause seizures that are really dangerous are trauma. So let's say your daughter, Carl, was in the bathroom and slipped and hit her head, and that's why she was having a seizure. Well, on the CT scan, they'd be able to see brain bleeds. That's why they take a CT scan. They can see brain bleeds, and they can see tumors pretty well, or evidence of tumors, by your brain being shifted to one side. They call it mass effect, where kind of the tumor will push the rest of the brain tissue to one side. So you can kind of see patterns that there is something in there. And then they would want to get better imaging, which would be an MRI. And the other thing that you would want, well, so bleeds and brain tumors would be like the two things that are very scary. Also, brain infections. So if you have, it's called, now I'm not going to be able to, meningitis or encephalitis. So if you have some type of virus or bacteria or fungus or something like that that's in your brain, it's not supposed to be there, and it can cause seizures as well. So all those things need to be ruled out because they're very, very serious and they need to be treated seriously. So, as I would say, even if you think it's just a febrile seizure, still go to the doctor and still get it checked out. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah, I think, who am I to say? I think you're right. You're the doctor, but I think you're right. I think
I
it's certainly.
disagree.
And nobody cares, Tim.
Can you kick Tim off the call now?
Hey, you know what? I'll bet I could get a certain. Never mind. I'm not going to say uppity things about. Never mind. We want to keep all our viewers.
Right, exactly. Okay, so are you saying, Jonny, though, that they could probably wait until after the seizure's over and drive them to their normal pediatrician, or would they need to go to the emergency room, or what do you recommend?
So it's probably easier to go to the emergency room because they probably will need a CT scan. And most places don't have a CT scanner just in like an office. So going to the emergency room is probably going to be the best bet.
Having seen my daughter, I can't imagine seeing her like that and thinking, yeah, I'll probably wait till tomorrow.
Yeah, and
So,
another thing that you have to remember about seizures is after somebody has a seizure, all that activity in their brain, they call it postictal. So after you have your seizure, you're not in your normal state of mind for usually like 5 to 10 minutes. So most seizures won't last more than a couple minutes at the most. That would be like a very long seizure, and seizures can be very short, like 10 seconds. But after your brain has all that activity, it takes a while for it to reset and for you to regain consciousness. So your daughter being completely out of it when you're asking her questions, that would be completely expected. And it's really freaky for people that have never seen somebody that has a seizure and seen how out of it that they can be afterwards. That they're not like awake. You can't ask them their name. You can't do any of that stuff. And then in 5 minutes you ask them, and they can tell you everything. So it's very interesting how the brain takes a minute to calm down and to reset.
Okay.
So can I pause for a second? I know, like, in general what a seizure is. I know it's your brain activity and kind of what it looks like, but can we get like an official or more specific definition of what exactly is going on with the seizure? What's happening in the brain? How is it affecting the body, and so forth?
Yeah, so the seizure does happen in the brain. So it's generally there's a focus of neurons that misfires. Now, all your brain is set up on basically electrical signals. So if you think like there's this intricate network of all these cells that are communicating with each other with electrical signals, which allows you to, remain conscious. Now, when one of those misfires, it can spread to the entire brain, and they'll misfire. So, sometimes you'll get like a neuron that misfires. It's not a big deal. You probably don't even notice. It's not bad at all. But if there's a group of neurons that starts to misfire in like a rhythmic way, then it will trigger the rest of the neurons around it to do the same thing, and then it will spread across the entire brain. Now so this is just generally, there are some seizures that only affect a small part of the brain, but the more popular seizures are the ones that affect the entire brain. So it's all in your brain. Now, the seizures can affect anything that your brain controls, which is everything in your body.
There we go.
So a lot of times people think of like muscle jerking. So if the part of your brain called the motor cortex, if that is involved in seizure activity, you will have muscle jerking. That's just what will happen because those neurons in your brain are firing and telling your arms and your legs to move. And so you'll have that jerking motion. And it's just something that happens because that part of the brain is firing. So, I mean, lots of different things can happen when you have a seizure. A seizure can really look like anything, but the ones that we think about are like the body shaking or the body getting rigid. I would say that those are probably like the most common things. But people usually don't breathe when they're having a seizure either, which can be a little bit scary because if it starts to last a little while, they can start to turn like a little bit blue and stuff like that. But you have to stop breathing for a long time in order to get brain damage from that. I mean, I don't know how long actually, but usually people, even if it's like 5-10 minutes, I think that they usually come out just fine. But if you start getting into like 15-20 minutes, then I think that it gets a little more concerning that you have had this hypoxia or decreased oxygen to the brain, and that can lead to issues. But normally, just like a 1 to 2 minute seizure, not gonna cause permanent brain damage.
So what do you do let's say you suspect that your kid is having a seizure, or anyone, I guess. What are you supposed to do to help take care of them and make sure they're okay?
So the one thing that you really want to keep in mind is that they're not conscious. Like you can't yell at them and say, "Hey, move over," or anything like that. They generally will not know what is going on. They won't have control over their body. So keeping them away from things that could harm themselves, like if somebody's prone to have seizures, probably driving is a bad idea.
Right.
Or like, if they're on a hike by cliffs, you'd want to get them away from that. Or if they're using power tools or anything like that, things that if you're unconscious, you could hurt yourself with those things. Make sure they're away from those things. In the hospital, we always lie the person on their side because a lot of times when people have seizures, they will vomit. And if you vomit and when you kind of come to from your seizure, you will breathe in and you can breathe in your vomit, and that can cause a pneumonia just because the bacteria from your stomach can get down into your lungs and it can cause injury. So you lay them on their side so that that doesn't happen, and you pad the sides of the bed with pillows so that they don't hurt themselves. But generally, if somebody's just on the floor having a seizure, help them down to the floor, but you don't need to like hold them still or anything like that. You can let them seize, but turn them on their side so they don't choke or anything like that.
Okay. Yeah, that's what, and we got some follow-up advice from the doctor as we were discharged from the hospital, and it was essentially that, just, make sure they're not going to choke, lay them on their side, and then just try to keep them away from things that will hurt them. So, for example, when my daughter was on the toilet, and the doctor said, just lay her down on the ground, make sure she's not, because on the toilet, obviously, crack your head on the porcelain, something like that. So that was essentially the same advice that we got from the doctor there. You also already mentioned febrile seizures. Once a child has had one, they're far more common. It's far more likely that they have another one. So I think you said 40%. I think between 30 and 40%, I think is what we heard. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's pretty high.
Yeah.
So if a kid is prone to have, a kid can be prone to have febrile seizures. And also, some of these kids that have febrile seizures will go on to develop epilepsy, which is something that I didn't really know what epilepsy was before medical school. Basically, it's when you have unprovoked seizures. So there's not a reason that you're having your seizure. You don't have an infection. You don't have a brain bleed. You don't have a fever. You don't have any sicknesses. You don't have a brain tumor. You don't have a reason to be having seizures or seizure activity in your brain, but you're having seizures. Now, everybody gets a freebie, so everybody can have one unprovoked seizure and not have epilepsy. But as soon as you have two, then you have epilepsy. So that just means that you have these unprovoked seizures, and you have to be on medication to control that.
All right. Yeah, thanks. I guess, yeah.
I went to massage school with an epileptic.
You did. So what was that, Cameron?
I went to massage school with an epileptic.
Epileptic.
If I can say that right.
Was that
Anyway,
he or she, they on medication?
I think she was on some medication, but anyway, so she was pregnant actually during the time, so I was doing a pregnant massage on her side, so she was on her side, and she actually started having a seizure during the massage and stuff like that. So
seems like
that was fun.
A pregnant seizure would be very scary.
Yeah, there's actually a condition called that women can get seizures while they're pregnant. It's very dangerous. But if you have a known seizure disorder, it's probably just your seizure disorder. And a lot of people have to stop taking their anti-seizure medications when they're pregnant, so they can have seizures while they're pregnant. But if you have really high blood pressure, that's called preeclampsia. And preeclampsia leads to eclampsia, which is like really bad seizures in pregnancy. It's very dangerous and deadly. So, the reason epileptics have to be on medication is because seizure activity can hurt your brain if it happens a lot. So it kind of burns out your brain if it happens all the time. So it's really important that people are on seizure medications, and it also allows them to have a normal life. So I don't know, every state has their own rules about, activities that are prohibited after you have a seizure. But I know at least in Alabama, you couldn't drive for an entire year after you had an unprovoked seizure. So it was really important for people to stay on their medications. And I mean, it makes perfect sense why.
Sure.
But that throws a complete wrench into things. If you've ever, lost your vehicle or driver's license or something and tried to get around for an entire year, that is a bumming rides off a lot of people, and you feel very dependent, and that can be very difficult for people. So anyway, it's really important for these people to stay on their medications so that they don't have these types of things happen.
Sure. Well, that's been very good to have you on. Well, of course, obviously, we wouldn't have done this podcast without Jonny, Dr. Jonny. I think we're going to be wrapping up. Let me ask if Tim or Cameron have any other information they want to share as far as seizure information.
I was going to say, I always heard if you saw someone that had a seizure, to always try to mark how long it lasted. So if it did get over that 5-minute range or 7-minute range, whatever it is, towards those grand malls, so EMTs can know that.
Yeah, it's really important to track. It's really hard to remember as an outsider to remember how long a seizure is, and they usually seem longer than they actually are. But if you don't remember to do anything, turn them on their side and start a timer, and make sure you know how long the seizure is, when it started, when it stopped, and then how long they were kind of out of it afterwards. And then any other seizures after that, do the same exact thing, and have all that timetable with you as you go into the emergency room, because they're going to want that, and everyone's going to ask for that, and it's easier to remember if you just write it down. So that is a really good tip, Cameron.
That is. Thank you, Cameron, because they asked us a bunch of times, how long did it, how long did this last? And unfortunately, we were able to give them very little information, because once again, we found her in the middle of, or at least at some point already having started the seizure. So, okay, Tim, you were saying?
Oh yeah. Well, so first of all, what is a grand mal seizure versus another kind of seizure? Like, is that just length of time? Is it the amount of brain activity happening, or what is it?
So grand mal is actually, they don't really use that as seizure definitions anymore. What they do is they classify it by how much of the brain is happening. So grand mal was basically just these tonic-clonic seizures where you have like the body movements, like the full body jerking. That was a tonic-clonic seizure, or a grand mal seizure is what it was called as before. And that just means that your entire brain is being affected by the seizure. The entire brain is. So.
Okay, as opposed to say your left side or something.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can have a focal seizure, which is only part of your brain. And so like maybe your left arm twitches and that's your seizure, or you lose vision in your left eye, or it could be anything like that if it's only part of your brain that is being affected. But when it becomes the entire brain, it's known as generalized seizure, and it usually has these tonic-clonic movements, which people refer to as the grand mal seizure.
Okay. I wonder if, I know that dolphins and other like marine mammals, their brains, they don't sleep like we do. I wonder if they have seizures.
Yeah, I don't really know. I've had very little interaction in medical school with marine life.
Come on, you got to get out more.
I want my doctor trained also as a marine biologist.
Dolphins can like sleep half their brain at a time so that they can still remember to like breathe underwater and stuff.
Yeah.
So,
One last thing I was going to ask was about flashing lights, because I've heard that that's something that if you like, I don't know, red light, or is that a thing?
Yeah, so flashing lights can cause certain types of seizures. So there's all different types of seizures, and that you can provoke a seizure by like flashing lights. Sleep deprivation is a way to cause seizures. There's also like hyperventilation can cause a certain type of seizure. Anyway, so there's lots of different ways to provoke a seizure into happening, which can be great if you're hooked up to this EEG, which is an expensive test, and it's really painful to hook up, and you want somebody to have a seizure so that you can say, yes, this person has epilepsy, let's start them on medication, and you can flash some lights at them and, sleep deprive them and make them hyperventilate and try to make them have a seizure. And then if they don't have a seizure, then chances are that, maybe they don't have epilepsy, or maybe there's not something wrong. I'm Googling right now, do dolphins have seizures, by the way?
Okay. It's the question.
I believe there was a Pokemon episode that wasn't aired in the United States due to those flashing lights that may cause seizures.
I know that all kinds of programs have to be careful with flashing lights. I recently watched a show on Netflix that had to start the show had a big disclaimer across the top that said, if you're prone to seizures, essentially don't watch this.
Oh wow!
Because there was a
Star Wars films had those.
Right.
Yeah, I mean anything with a brain can technically have a seizure. So I'm just reading about dogs that have seizures right now. But anyway.
Interesting. All right.
You found your life's mission, Jonny.
To find every type of seizure in every mammal.
There we go.
Yeah, I'm giving you a challenge right now to find the smallest seizure ever, like animal-wise.
Okay.
Okay.
How long do I have to do this?
20
I'm a great
years.
procrastinator, so give me years, please.
Yeah.
Okay, there you
All
go.
right.
Sure.
Okay. All right. We're gonna wrap the podcast here, and this is once again where I say I'd like our audience to share this podcast, mostly because I think it's really good information. I think a lot of people know kind of generally about epilepsy, about seizures, but what was unclear to me as a parent was how frequent they are in children. And febrile seizures are, once again, if it's not your kid in your kindergarten class, it's somebody else, most likely in your kid's kindergarten class. It's either has had one or will have one. And so it is really common. And as a parent, not knowing that and not essentially being familiar with what that looks like, and what Jonny just explained to us about, postictal stuff and things like that. It was living hell for about 90 minutes, and if we can avoid that, and I mean, it is, for the children, it is what it is, right? They're gonna have a seizure. It's gonna be really pretty miserable. Hopefully nothing long term, but and in most cases for febrile seizures, it's not. But for the parents, it's hopefully at least to some degree you can better understand what's going on, which would have been really nice for me. And so I'm hoping that if we can share this around, get this around to anyone that that is either has children or might have children, and then obviously anyone else that would be so essentially anyone. And so get this information out there, because it's out there. Obviously, you can Google it, but I want people, like, this needs to be something the parents know. I feel like there needs to be a parental handbook that has a page about febrile seizures. That should be alongside, what to do when your baby screams. But anyway, so thank you, Jonny, for all the information.
Yeah, of course. Glad I was able to get some time off so I could help you guys. I was sad that I had to miss out on so many.
Yeah, well, that's the life of a doctor. So thanks, Cameron and Tim, for your contributions as well. And we'll ask you once again, share this podcast. Do whatever you got to do to get this around so parents are more familiar. Nobody has to experience that like I did. And we'll see you back next podcast.
Adios.